I'm Tom Axworthy, Chair of Public Policy here at Massey College. We're delighted you could attend on this colloque on liberal internationalism, both a look back at the past. This is part of our series celebrating the centennial of Pierre Trudeau. And in the fall, in October, we had a session largely devoted to politics. He had some small relation to that on the leadership arts of Pierre Trudeau. Today, we are looking at foreign policy with a frame of liberal internationalism. And if the principal agrees, next fall, we will complete the year celebration of Pierre Trudeau with a similar session on his domestic policy on the just society. We will be doing that in partnership with the law school. And so welcome to Massey. I have just one or two housekeeping notices, and then I'll introduce my co-chair, who will introduce our principal. We are filming and putting on audio the results of today's discussion. Eventually, it will be up on the Massey website. So a warning to all of you, if you intend to be indiscreet, eventually it will be on YouTube. Secondly, as we look at going forward and going back, we've done our best here to have some of our speakers who are closely associated with Pierre Trudeau personally in helping to devise those policies, and others who are critics and academics who will try to put it into context, and then others again who will be looking forward to say, this is what happened then, where are we now? And of course, we are meeting in a time of crisis in the Middle East. There is always seems to be crisis in the Middle East, but this is also a real day of reckoning and also tragedy, as many Canadians and many Iranians coming to Canada themselves were victims of the fog of war, or the fog of undeclared war. We don't know the exact circumstances yet, but recent events certainly illustrate that as we discuss liberal internationalism, which had at its core the rule of law and to promote international law step by step, inch by inch, we have probably regressed in a very dramatic way in recent times on that file. That's what we'll be examining today, to see its continuing relevance, we hope, but also realistically what may occur. So I'm also very happy then to have as my co-chair Margaret Biggs, who's had an enormously distinguished career in the Privy Council office. She's chair of the board of the IDRC. She's a former president of CETA. And among those great honors, probably the greatest is she's been recently appointed a visiting fellow at Massey College on Foreign and Defense Policy, along with the Graham Center. And the Graham Center at Trinity College are our partners in today's colloque, as is the Canadian International Council. And we have good participation from speakers and participants from both those organizations. So we're delighted to have those partnerships at Massey. And so now I will turn to our co-chair, Margaret Biggs.
Thanks, Tom. It's a huge pleasure to be here today and to have you all join us. I can't imagine a more timely and relevant topic for our deliberations. It's a real honor for me now to introduce to you our host and our principal, Nathalie Desrosiers, who was elected in last May and installed just this October as the principal of Massey College. And I'm sure you all know that she's had a brilliant career. She's had many honors. I just want to pull out a few things. She's a distinguished scholar, an experienced academic leader, having most recently been the Dean of Law at the University of Ottawa. But she's particularly known for her passion for the academic mission, for nurturing young scholars, for breaking down barriers between disciplines, for the pursuit of knowledge and new ideas. And she's been a leading advocate for human rights, civil liberties, and inclusion. And the theme of her installation speech was around ethics, community, and leadership. And I think that theme has lots of relevance for the discussion that we're going to have here today, not just here at home in Canada, but also in terms of Canada's global footprint and its global foreign policies. So let's welcome our host, Nathalie Desrosiers.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to Massey. What a great day and what a timely discussion we're going to have. Let me say, because Massey benefits from a wonderful relationship with the Mississaugas of the Credit, I want to acknowledge that this land is a land where many Indigenous people have lived and continue to live, and we are grateful for the opportunity to continue to hold our debates here. Last night at dinner, I sat beside a junior fellow who is in medical school, and you may know that the medical school canceled all classes yesterday because one of the victim of the crash was student at University of Toronto. So we sat, and both of us were reflecting on the way in which tragedies, mishaps, stupidity that occurs far away has repercussions at home, and how important, I think. And he was reflecting on the way in which, to him, the world had shrunk. He felt as a citizen of the world, he felt that this was hitting close to home, not only because it was his colleague that had died, but also because he is of Middle Eastern origin. Last time we were gathered together to celebrate the centennial of Pierre Trudeau. Sacha Trudeau ended by saying when he walks down Toronto and he sees the diversity, he sees that's the legacy of Pierre Trudeau. And he said, we don't need more symposiums, we just need to walk down. But that's okay, I think we can still have symposium to think it through. And I think today, where we're going to reflect on liberal internationalism, then and now, I think the legacy of Pierre Trudeau and the way in we want to feel, and we do feel the citizenry of the world. We do feel a sense of worrisome when things happen elsewhere. We have a sense of worry, a sense of compassion. And I think that's also the legacy of Pierre Trudeau that we are going to celebrate today. I want to thank Margaret and Tom for putting what a stellar day of reflection for all of us. And I invite you all to continue to bring ideas forward at Massey so that we can be present to the world and exercise the type of intellectual leadership that is needed. I'm slowly developing the program for Massey for the next few years, and I welcome all of your contribution. Merci beaucoup. Have a great day.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we had hoped and planned that my brother Lloyd, former foreign minister, would be joining us today. Unfortunately, just before Christmas, he had some health troubles, and but thank God to Medicare and the skill of our medical professionals. He had a significant heart operation, but he has on the road to recovery, and not wanting to let Lloyd just have repose. The day after he came out of hospital, we sent in a crew to film him making a video for the conference. So he is not with us in person, but if the technology works, we have a video of Lloyd reflecting on some of the themes of today.
Good morning. Lloyd Axworthy here, and I'm really quite pleased that the organizers, particularly my brother Tom, has given me this opening slot. I think that this is really a good opportunity to stand back, take a pause, look at the liberal DNA on international foreign policy issues, and consider how the contributions that arose from that has had a really significant influence, not only in various parts of the world or in the multilateral system, but its impact on Canadians itself in terms of who we are, what we do, and the kind of goals and purposes we have. I know that sometimes history can be misleading, but I want to go back a little bit just to explain. I've basically had about 50 years of both involvement, engagement, and acquaintance with with being a liberal in Canada, both in a philosophical way, but certainly in an operational way. And I guess I was maybe one of those many people in the country who became pragmatic liberal idealists, feeling that by doing the right thing and the good thing, you were also doing the necessary thing. But here are things that I think where we have some pluses and minuses. To me, the biggest gap and vacuum right now is the lack of Canadian participation in dealing with the nuclear crisis. The START Treaty is the last remaining arms control treaty between the Russians and the Americans on the use of nuclear weapons. It comes to an end next year. Negotiations have to start, and there's no inkling that either side is putting much effort. That means we will once again be in a kind of Wild West with nuclear weapons. And far more countries want to be part of that game. Well, I think going back to our 1945-46 decision to be the first to withdraw from that, I think we have a real obligation to get re-engaged on developing an arms control platform and to use our convening power and our power of influence and soft power to make that a change. The other area, which of course I have to mention, but I think it's crucial, is that the issue of the increasing demographic change in the world towards more displaced people. We now have close to 60 to 80 million people without any home, without identity. With climate change coming in, that's going to be another 20, 30, 40 million in the next 20 or 30 years. And the refugee system now is at a breaking point. The kinds of attacks coming from the Americans, from certain European countries, certainly in Asia, China. And I've been working with the World Refugee Council the last couple of years. And what deeply concerns, what do you do to somebody who no longer has a home, doesn't have a piece of paper, has no identity? Do they get a loan? Do the kids go to school? Do they get health care? No, they don't. And the refugee system is broke. And therefore, there has to be a real commitment. And it was encouraging when the Trudeau government came back in 2015, making a case on Syrian refugees and things. But we really tapered off, and I think we're increasingly buying in to put the border walls up. Our attitude towards refugees has changed, and I think the kind of leadership that we could provide in that area needs to be revived and reset. A third area, which is clearly climate and environment, but you know something? Let's be honest about it. We'll never be taken with any credibility unless we clear up our own act domestically. And the idea that we can support major projects that create much larger emissions and at the same time take a leadership in reducing emissions needs to be somehow more clearly defined, articulated, and maybe changed. And the final thing I would want to bring to bear is to say, that North-South issue. Right now, the number of conflicts that are taking place inside countries, not invasions, but inside countries, and the UN has become almost useless. We have peacekeepers around the world, but if you look at the threats and risks, the Boko Haram and the ISIS and others, the threat of terrorism and the displacement that's going on around the world of ordinary people is tragic. And I would hope again that that's something. I think the government, following what Harper's did, focusing on women and children is the right arena, but we just have to be a little bit more broad-based. And some of the work we've been doing through the World Refugee Council to, for example, convert frozen assets to direct humanitarian assistance are the kinds of things I hope the government will take a serious look at.
So finally, ladies and gentlemen, Lloyd being Lloyd, discovering that I had edited his speech. sent the following message, begging, he had one or two more things he wanted to say. Begging the indulgence of the conference goers, I would like to offer a few additional thoughts arising out of the breaking news in the last 72 hours. First, in light of the downing of the Ukrainian airliner carrying so many Canadians, it's time to reconsider the need for a full-time diplomatic relationship with Iran. The cancellation of this relationship in 2012 was purely domestic politics, if not theological. It was not rational. We are now drawn into what is a complicated consular investigative process that needs constant navigation, that can't be handled on an ad hoc basis or working through other governments' emissaries. Parliament should be engaged in a review with public discussion. Related to the Trump dictum that NATO must now take on an expanded role, agreed, but not one necessarily dictated by the Americans. As I try to emphasize in my brief talk, Canada has always had a healthy skepticism of great power machinations and has promoted multilateral international agency. That is now the imperative. Canada must take on a task, along with others, in forging a combined effort as NATO used to undertake in Bosnia and Kosovo to protect civilians, provide security, and partner in rebuilding. This means upping our game in the Middle East. Thanks for the final footnote.
So the first panel, the theme loosely is liberal internationalism, is Pierre Trudeau's worldview obsolete. So our chair is going to be Joanne Davis, who's the head of the Toronto chapter of the Canadian International Council. And she's been operating a key member of CIC from coast to coast for many years. Professionally, she's the senior associate at Lehman Group. It's a Toronto-based management consulting firm, and she's led many strategic change initiatives over many years. She's also a China specialist, a St. Michael's College UOT grad, a University of London, et cetera. So she's well placed to chair this session here this morning with her colleagues. Then probably does not need introduction as well is one of his books is up here, as well is Bob Fowler, former deputy minister, foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. During his 38-year public service career, Bob was the foreign policy advisor, as I said, to not just Prime Minister Trudeau, but also to Prime Minister Turner and Prime Minister Mulroney. He was the Deputy Minister for National Defence and Canada's longest-serving ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to Italy, and, of course, the 3 UN-based Rome organizations. In 2005, he chaired the Prime Minister Martin's Special Advisory Team on Sudan, and he retired from official duties in 2006, but he's been busy on many other fronts. So I'm going to move then to our next speaker. Do we have the order? Maureen next? Okay. So Maureen is the former president and head of the International Development Research Center. She was also the president of the North-South Institute for well over a decade, and during a really important time that we'll pick up here today. And she's also been most recently the president of the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, where she's done a lot to reorient the foundation from its previous mandate on applied health services research to its current role in healthcare improvement. She's also been played an important role in governance. She's president of IDRC, of course, but she's also served on the CG board and has provided guidance on many other fronts. She's, just one last thing, she's the former chair of the board of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and other things related to International Institute for Environment and Development. Our third and final speaker is from our partner organization, from the Graham Center on Foreign and Defense Policy at Toronto at Trinity College. And Greg is previously was the leading scholar in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs. He also is a U of T grad with his bachelor's from the University of Toronto. But he was the head of the historical section in Global Affairs Canada. I got the chance to read some of his articles as I was preparing for this conference, and you realize the extent to which he's really mined the depths of the archives of generations of leaders in foreign policy. He's written over 50 scholarly articles and reviews on the history of Canadian foreign policy, edited and co-edited many volumes and scholarly essays on Canadian history, diplomacy, and foreign policy. And most recently, and there was an event, a book launch here at the University of Toronto in the fall, it included the A Samaritan State Revisited, Historical Perspectives on Canadian Foreign Aid, which he co-edited. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to turn it over to our chair, Joanne, to introduce the panel and have our talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here this morning and to be taking part in this conference today. The first question being raised this morning is Pierre Elliott Trudeau's world vision obsolete? So with Pearson having set the stage globally, in many ways, Trudeau continued where Pearson had left off, breaking further ground on Canada's behalf. Globally, his view included the promotion of individual civil rights and independence of nation states, global power sharing and redistribution, détente and multilateral relationships, nuclear de-escalation and arms reduction. So my succinct answer would be, if these views are obsolete, then God help us. His tenure included the opening up of relations with China in 1970, something the United States would then follow 2 years later in 1972. The assertion of our jurisdictional rights over the Arctic Ocean, something critically important, and obviously a battleground for the USA and the USSR at the time. Seeking to minimize Canada's economic dependence on the United States, something we continue to do. The express view of expanding international governance and decision-making beyond the traditional power brokers in the West, and something we're seeing as a reality with the G20. And the recognition that providing access to markets alone is not enough for the world without deep global structural improvements to banking, health, and access to education, among other things. So without further ado, looking at the panelists we have before us and wanting to provide them with as much time as possible, I would like to first call upon Mr. Fowler to begin our discussion this morning.
I wondered if I'd get away with saying this or have already been preempted. So let me say welcome to the 20s.
Quite afraid.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for the introductions. Hello to so many old friends, it's been too long since I've been in this room talking to a Toronto audience. So, thank you for inviting me. So, Ralph Waldo Emerson said that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. The first part of that quote is pretty commonplace, but few recall how it continued. Pierre Trudeau was no little statesman. In fact, just last week, the Association for Canadian Studies voted him the greatest Canadian Prime Minister of the 20th century. As necessary, he had the wisdom and courage to hold conflicting, sometimes contradictory views. By any measure, he was an exceptional man, brilliant, brave, visionary, forceful. From my perspective, his reputation for greatness is multifaceted, but in essence, it stems from his willingness to risk all when he believed the world was facing the very real prospect of a nuclear apocalypse. This morning, I'll explore selected aspects of Pierre Trudeau's worldview and the actions he took as one of the West's elder statesmen to make his world, and our country better, safer places. My comments cannot be comprehensive, not in the short time available. I will therefore focus on his geostrategic engagement and spend much of my allotted time on his peace initiative, as it encapsulates so much of who he was and how he saw the principal challenges to world order and stability. I'll leave it to you to determine whether there would be much room on today's international stage for such an audacious and creative visionary, but I think we better trust in God or thank God or find God somewhere to help us along. Or indeed how he would have fared and what he would have done in the face of the miserable international circumstances in which we find ourselves today. I will not discuss to any extent his approach to the development challenge, as I presume my friend Maureen O'Neill will do that in her always perceptive fashion. He did care. He was among the early adopters of the need to articulate and close the gap between first and third worlds, between North and South. But I do not believe that he and his government did enough to alleviate the plight of the bottom billions. Canada's best development assistance performance in terms of GDP per capita was achieved under his leadership, but 0.54 is hardly something to crow about, and today's figure is just about half of that. Similarly, while of particular interest to me, I'll not dwell on his distant and often awkward relationship with Canada's defence establishment, its unmet requirements, and its diminishing place in the effective assurance of the security of our country and that of our friends. So, as Assistant Secretary of the Cabinet for Foreign and Defence Policy, I served as Mr. Trudeau's foreign policy advisor during his final term in office, that is, from March 1980 through June 84. During those 4 years, he spent a total of 203 days abroad. I have counted them. On official government business, showing the flag and making the case for a better, safer, fairer, and more harmonious world, while establishing the personal relationships which make those things possible. Mr. Trudeau was an exacting and exciting boss and an utter delight to work for, but never easy. He was a leader of vision and of ideas. He was always principled, but also pragmatic. He valued advice from every quarter, but was very much his own man, taking full responsibility for his every action. When I moved from External Affairs to the Privy Council in the spring of 1980, I was 36 and he was 60, and he knew a hell of a lot more about foreign defense and development policy than I did. He didn't expect to be Canada's Prime Minister in the 80s, but finding himself back in that position, he was determined to lead Canada into a larger and more significant role in global affairs than ever before. Sure, there had been Mike Pearson's pivotal role in defusing the Suez Crisis in the mid-50s, which, in the words of the CBC, had led Canada into middle power respectability. But a quarter century later, Mr. Trudeau was adamant about taking nothing for granted. No policy, no precedent. Every foreign commitment and shibboleth had to be questioned, scrutinized, and validated. When he became Prime Minister, he set about re-examining everything: NATO, the Commonwealth, even the UN. And while he sought to remove the state from the bedrooms of the nation, he was ever uncomfortable with sharing that bed with the elephant next door. I don't believe he ever wanted Canada to leave NATO, or the Commonwealth for that matter, but he was troubled by the rigidity of Cold War thinking and sought from his foreign policy advisors original counsel rather than warmed over Cold War rhetoric. Great power dominance always grated, particularly, of course, as the United States assumed the mantle of the greatest power, and Canada's wagon became ever more inexorably attached thereto. Yes, we were members of alliances and organizations of like-minded states, but he sought to assure the world that we were more than that we understood and cared about the issues and predicaments which concerned them. He was always deeply preoccupied by the dichotomies of theory and practice, of principle and pragmatism. I think Trudeau believed that his predecessors, as leaders of the Liberal Party, particularly post-World War II, were overly willing to accept that ours must be a subservient relationship to the United States and to the UK, an attitude he thought had colored most of our approaches to international issues. He sought to reduce these historical dependencies and move Canada's voice and place in the world out from under what he deemed to be an unduly submissive or at best acquiescent posture vis-a-vis London and Paris, and freer from the manifest destiny of our powerful neighbor. Pierre Trudeau had actively opposed the Vietnam War and ensured that Canada would welcome fleeing draft dodgers. Pearson had acquiesced, however reluctantly, in the 1963 acceptance of the basing of nuclear-armed Bomarc missiles in Canada, causing him to be termed by Pierre Trudeau, the defrocked Pope or Prince of Peace. 20 years later, Trudeau agreed that the Americans could test unarmed air-launched cruise missiles designed to carry nuclear warheads in northern Alberta. Both Pearson and Trudeau defended their decisions on the basis of our mutual defense obligations as members of NATO and NORAD. His wrenching cruise missile testing dilemma was, of course, further complicated by NATO's 1979 dual-track decision, agreed by the Clark government and then endorsed by Trudeau's Liberals, to deploy nuclear-armed, intermediate-ranged, ground-launched cruise and Pershing II ballistic missiles in Europe. Thus, the refuse the cruise refrain in the streets had relevance across the Atlantic as well as across the alliance. Pierre Trudeau was a pragmatist, just as during the October crisis, having told his clerk, Gordon Robertson, and then his wife, that had they been captured by terrorists, he would make no concession to win their freedom. He then spun on a dime and did so, providing the kidnappers of James Cross with safe transport to the airport and a flight to Cuba. In that case, reality trumped theory, pragmatism trumped principle, and he was strong enough and confident enough and intelligent enough to understand that that was the right thing to do. On the matter of cruise missile testing, the same pragmatism prevailed. He was well aware of a growing burden of fractious issues with the United States, among them U.S. policy in Central America, insistence on rigorous screening of foreign investment, and moves to increase Canadian control over the energy sector. He knew the ledger needed rebalancing. He was aware that there was some inchoate point of imbalance in that vital relationship, which, if reached, would inexorably bring unpleasant consequences for Canada, over which he would have little control. His cruise testing decision rebalanced, to a degree, that ledger. And buoyed by the advocacy of the reinvigorated peace movement, he felt free to launch a campaign to solve what he deemed to be the clear and present existential crisis, the unconstrained nuclear arms race spiraling out of control. How can one not be struck by the irony of today's circumstances when considering that it was the shooting down of KAL Flight 007 by Soviet fighter planes over the Kamchatka Peninsula, in which both Canadian and American lives were lost, in the late summer of '83, which spurred him into action? I agree with those that believe in launching such a high-risk initiative. He was mindful of the fact that his leadership of a mid-level but still significant NATO country was coming to an end. And he was determined to use his office and the personal credibility he'd accumulated around the world to seek a reduction of the nuclear brinksmanship which was threatening global annihilation. Rather, that is, than subsequently pontificating from a consequence and responsibility-free retirement about what ought to have been done. He'd always been a strong advocate of nuclear arms control and disarmament, and he chafed constantly over that position being at odds with NATO's formally agreed defense strategy, anchored in the first use of nuclear weapons, a conflict he never managed to fully resolve. Brett Thompson, in a fine essay in 2009 entitled Pierre Elliott Trudeau's Peace Initiative 25 Years On, notes that at Reagan's Williamsburg summit in May '83, Trudeau had admonished his G7 colleagues for their lack of concern about rising East-West tensions, insisting that we should be busting our asses for peace. He doesn't, though, mention Maggie Thatcher's snide response, which was, "Oh, Pierre, you're such a comfort to the Kremlin." Her objections notwithstanding, Trudeau succeeded in getting summit leaders at Williamsburg to issue a statement, the final paragraph of which read, "We commit ourselves to devote our full political resources to reducing the threat of war. We have a vision of a world in which the shadow of war has been lifted from all mankind, and we are determined to pursue that vision." In a toast to Prime Minister Thatcher in Toronto during her September '83 visit, Trudeau said, "The influence of nuclear accountants and technical experts has grown too strong. Politicians need to reassert political control and end megaphone diplomacy between the superpowers." A couple of weeks later, at the University of Guelph in October, our Prime Minister spoke of an ominous rhythm of crisis and asserted that the relationship between the superpowers may have become too charged with animosity for East-West relations to be trusted to them alone. Well, NATO didn't think much of the suggestion that they could no longer be trusted to lead responsibly. Reagan and above all Thatcher were obdurate. Our continental European allies were overwhelmed and preoccupied by the massive protests in their streets against the sightings of new generations of nuclear weapons across Europe. The Soviet leadership was in dangerous and unpredictable flux. Trudeau's decision to take it to the people over the heads of their elected representatives was audacious in the extreme, and as he knew well, would win him few friends and supporters among his NATO colleagues. It must be difficult, particularly for those of you under 50. Are there any of you under 50? Sorry, to fully appreciate the extent of the angst and downright fear with which we witnessed the geopolitical antics and aggressive military posturing which permeated those times. Perhaps not that difficult. Suffice it to say, it was impossible to follow the news without a pervading sense of dread and helplessness. Trudeau felt he had to do whatever it took to banish that specter of doom. There are those who still believe the peace initiative was on the one hand but a craven political ploy to burnish the Liberal Party's fading electoral prospects. On the other, among Prime Minister Trudeau's political advisors and cabinet colleagues, there were those who worried about the negative political implications of their boss's romp across 15 countries in search of peace. However, in all those sessions in Ottawa and throughout those foreign travels, I never heard from Pierre Trudeau the slightest hint of an ulterior motive. Yes, there was disgruntlement in external affairs and from its minister, the redoubtable Alan J. McEachen, because this Canada-defining foreign policy initiative was not made there, and also because it was clear that the Americans wouldn't and didn't like it. And external affairs has always worried about that stuff. Trudeau's priorities, though, were clear and different. He made known from the outset that, in his words, the prevention of nuclear war is more important than Canada-US relations. Shall I say that again? No, sorry. Now, after the Guelph speech, Trudeau embarked on a tour of Central and Western European capitals. He also met with the Pope and the UN Secretary General, and he traveled to Beijing to make Deng Xiaoping the remaining nuclear power. It was always, though, about Washington and London and Moscow. Through November and December, a meeting with the ailing Andropov had been impossible to nail down. Early in the new year, we were finally able to meet Andropov's successor, Chernyenko, at the former's funeral, where Trudeau was told unequivocally by the Soviets that the responsibility for bringing about any kind of change in the poisonous confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact lay squarely in the West's court. In Beijing, he met Deng in late November. What I remember most about that meeting was Deng declaring, "I can take 500 million casualties," and then asking, "How many can you in the West absorb?" On 9 November 1984, Trudeau drew the initiative to a close with a speech in the House of Commons, which he concluded by stating that Canada saw the crisis, acted, took risks, was loyal and open, and did what we could to lift the shadow of war. He announced his retirement after his famous walk in the snow on the 29th of February 1984. There is endless debate. Bob will know. There is endless debate as to whether Trudeau's meeting with Reagan in Washington in December had a significant effect. I was there. It did. He got to Reagan by assuring the president that although much loved and admired at home and abroad, in these difficult times, people needed to hear the president was also a man of peace. And this ought to inform an important part of his legacy. Trudeau did not, though, change the hostile attitude of Reagan's officials, who, of course, were responsible for the president's previous bellicose posturing, and more germane, the subsequent spin on that meeting. The last thing they wanted to transmit was that Trudeau had indeed changed the mind of the president. But change he did. Reagan's rhetoric softened. He became open to a different relationship with Moscow and more sympathetic to the turmoil in Europe. Tensions between East and West were progressively and publicly reduced. Indeed, 2 years later, Reagan met with yet another Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, in Reykjavik to discuss nuclear arms reduction. They failed to reach an agreement in Iceland. But a year later, they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned all short and intermediate range land-based missiles, which were then removed from Europe. Within 5 more years, the historic SALT I and SALT II agreements were signed, drastically reducing American and Russian nuclear arsenals by 80%. Pierre Trudeau's peace initiative was, as he knew well, imperfect and, yes, hastily conceived. But it had to be. Neither he nor the world had, he believed, the time or the opportunity to do it differently. The bottom line was that he saw the world spiraling towards disaster and a pressing need for action. He moved decisively to lift the shadow of war, using the extraordinary global credibility he had amassed over nearly 16 years in office, risking his own and Canada's reputation to change the course of history. His was the brave and noble act of a great man, to whose memory and accomplishments I am honored to pay homage today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fowler. And I'm going to call immediately upon our next speaker, Ms. Maureen O'Neill.
Good. Thank you. And thanks, Bob. That's magisterial. I'm going to talk more narrowly about the development aspects of Mr. Trudeau's North-South work. It could be much broader than development assistance. It could be, as in fact Lloyd mentioned, and as Natalie mentioned, look down the street in Toronto. The changes to immigration were significant and have had a huge impact in developing countries, because we know that the actual flow of resources from people who make their homes here back to their homes wherever they came from are the most significant global financial flows now. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the other great initiative on global negotiations that Trudeau undertook. And I want to talk a little bit about, and I'll go on to other things, but we think about the year of 1981, which seemed to be the high point of this activity. Canada chaired its first G7 meeting in Montebello. The Commonwealth heads of government met in Melbourne. And the Brandt Commission's Global Negotiations Conference took place in Cancun, co-chaired by Portillo and Trudeau, who was brought in as co-chair when Kreisky was ill. A little diversion on that. If you think about Kreisky and compare him to the young, almost Nazi leader of Austria now, that's another dimension of change in our world. At the Commonwealth Conference, Trudeau pushed very hard for global negotiations to boost, as he said, the dreadful state of the most impoverished lands. He declared, as Bob Lewis from Maclean's reported. Actually, I was amazed to see that Maclean's was reporting on the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. He might even have been sent there. The world's poised at either to launch a concerted attack on economic disparities or to let a momentous opportunity slip through its fingers. That's what Trudeau said. Lord Carrington, Margaret Thatcher's, we're both quoting Margaret Thatcher's staff here. I don't know what that tells us, Bob. Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington said it's very easy to use words. What we have to do is to devise practical steps to translate these things into reality. And I want to talk a little bit about the practical steps that Canada actually has put in place. The conviction that Trudeau had that one country or countries or regional entities could not actually solve these momentous problems, extraordinarily important. He was a big believer in multilateral solutions, and so we heard Lloyd this morning talk about the incapacity of the UN, which is always a worry. The fact is that strong support of multilateral agencies remains important. But national agencies and policies addressing global problems emerging from national agencies are essential, because where else does the policy of multilateral agencies come from? Both CETA and IDRC, the International Development Research Centre, were creations of during the first term of the Trudeau government. Their responsibilities were to devise those practical steps that Lord Carrington had looked for. In Canada, though, we'd been part of the Colombo Plan since about 1950, and that was a commitment, again emerging from a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, to attack the poverty upon which communist political movements were thought to feed. That was a big reason for the creation of development programs. It began, the Colombo Plan did, as an Asian focus, but expanded beyond. There were many scholarships given to developing country students. And interestingly, as my experience as part of, I think it was Bob's election team for the Security Council, these 20 years ago, included meeting with sub-Saharan African foreign ministers, and some of whom had been to Canada as part of Colombo Plan, with Colombo Plan scholarships. I must say, I had not expected to be asked about the Dalhousie skating rink when I was in Africa on this mission. There you see the benefits of these scholarships. CETA was created in 1969 and hoped to approach development not only based on conviction, but also based on what the best evidence was of what actually could work. Canadian missionaries and NGOs, of course, had been active in developing countries for years before, and organizations like the Unitarian Service Committee and the World University Services of Canada had long been active. And CETA recognized this and was one of the very first countries to actually work with non-government organizations, through non-government organizations, to deliver development assistance. This was quite different than what other countries did at the time. And this is not surprising, because as part of the approach that Trudeau took on the domestic front, and although this has certainly now fallen out of favor, Trudeau liked counterbalance. He was not as worried as we seem to have become as a country that there would be criticism from groups that were actually funded by government. And undoubtedly, government could be irritated by the constant and sometimes cheeky criticism from non-government organizations. But the underlying belief was that many voices made for better public policy. And the thinking was that business could write off their lobbying efforts as business expenses. Government funding of NGOs and not controlling them with that funding was seen as a rebalancing of the policy conversation. The North-South Institute, now dead, it couldn't survive the removal of base funding by the Harper government, was a think tank focused on policy research and recommendations for improvements to Canada's relations with developing countries in terms of aid, trade, international finance. It came to life in 1976, and Jerry Heliner, who's with us today, was very much a part of it and on its board for a long time and a key advisor. There was a kind of insider-outsider game to the critiques that came from NGOs and from the North-South Institute, because a smart minister and smart bureaucrats knew how to play the critique, because what minister is really going to be angry with an organization that's arguing that they should have more money to carry out their programs? North-South put out report cards under Bernard Wood, the terrific leader of the North-South Institute, put out report cards, and one in 1980 complained that overseas development assistance as a percentage of GNP had fallen from, I had 0.52, Bob had 0.54 in 1978, to 0.45, far away from the Pearsonian World Bank target of 0.7%. We could only wish to see that level of investment. Now we're down, we're now down below the average OECD country of 0.31%, which I must say, some of you here will remember Cran Pratt, in his very good book on Canadian aid, said that the Department of Finance in Ottawa never thought we should have any ODA above 0.3%. Well, they should be happy now, because we've fallen far below that. And we're far below the 5 members of the OECD who have actually cleared that 0.7% hurdle, including the Brits, who are still at about 0.7%. And yes, we can argue it was a silly number and all that, but at least it's visible evidence of commitment. But the North-South Institute also complained that not enough effort was put into convincing Canadians that this was a worthwhile place to spend their tax dollars. And I think that one of the reasons why it's been so easy for international development assistance to slide completely off the political radar is because of that. Countries that have invested a lot, like Sweden, have put huge amounts of money into public education about what this actually was, what it did, how people benefited. But Trudeau was rueful and honest about shortcomings. And in an article by Kim Nossel for the Dalhousie Review in the early 80s, he reported on this exchange with Pauline Jewett, who accused him in the House of talking a good line but doing very little on North-South issues, and especially in terms of the development budget. And Trudeau replied, there was a particular series of economic difficulties, remember we're in the early 80s here, which beset Canada, and we fell victim to those. I can only express regret that we did not find more room in the budget. Well, I was struck by this. First of all, it was a civilized exchange. That was interesting. But also the admission that, yes, we did fall short, and I'm really sorry we did. I think you'd have to look hard now to see that kind of exchange, both in the way in which the question was posed, and it's not like Pauline Jewett was a shrinking violet, but also the thoughtful response. Like CETA, IDRC was a child of the passion to create a better and fairer world. It also emerged from the work of Lester Pearson, but it was created because of the recognition that in the 60s, the entire developing world had only 2% of the world's R&D spending. And unsurprisingly, the thinking was that if you are not able to create your own research, your own evidence, neither are you going to be able as a country to create the solutions to your problems. Like CETA, Maurice Strong was involved. I think there should be a conference on the Trudeau years and the major personalities, because I think it's probably because I'm just not close enough to what actually happens now. But I mean, there were major personalities, and people were allowed to have personalities, and they were, and they had an impact. And Maurice Strong, the hand of Maurice Strong behind many things during this period, is evident, even if he didn't necessarily want it to be evident. Pearson was lobbied heavily by the magnificent Barbara Ward, an eminent British economist and sustainable development thinker. And actually, I always loved the story of her some years in 72. I think that was the year of the first big environmental conference that was held in Stockholm. And the Swedish students were demonstrating about something. And she went out and blasted them and said, "You have no right to say anything. Yes, you say you're a neutral country, but you were neutral on the side of the Germans." I always loved that story about her. She was a little tiny woman. And out she went and gave them what for. But she gave the Massey Lectures in 1961, and which were published as The Rich Nations and Poor Nations. And when I was at university, we had to read it as part of required summer reading. I think all of that's gone by the board now, but the idea that students had required summer reading and then were interrogated on it by their professors. Anyway, it had a big influence on me. But she got to Pearson, and she was a great friend of Morris Strong. And indeed, IDRC was created. The Act was brought into Parliament by the Honourable Mitchell Sharp. It was passed unanimously. Its purpose was to support developing country researchers to find solutions to problems in developing countries. It was not money that was fed through Canadian academics, which meant actually for IDRC they were missing a lobby for its future, but it was the board, the first board chaired by Pearson, went with the wonderful first president David Hopper's view that this should not be Canadian academics doing this work. If we were going to be consistent with our belief that research and development must be enhanced in developing countries, it should be their scientists who did the work. And that is what IDRC did, and that is what it continues to do. Barbara Ward was on the first board too. IDRC, as Margaret knows, because she chairs it, although the board is smaller now, it was reduced. IDRC's board is half international. Can you imagine now government agreeing to a crown corporation where taxpayers' money was being spent, where you had 21 people, 11 of whom were Canadians, the rest were international, mostly from developing countries. It had its own kind of deal under the Financial Administration Act. And this passed unanimously. This was truly a different moment. Now, two conservative governments tried to shut it down, but clever footwork and saner heads eventually prevailed. And this is not the place to detail its accomplishments. On January 15th, 1981, and I think this really sums up Trudeau's thinking, although Tom probably wrote the words, but I'm going to read it out because I thought it was stunning. This is what Trudeau asked us all. Who is my neighbor? Is she the woman rummaging for food in the back streets of an Asian shanty town? Is he the man in South America in prison for leading a trade union? The people dying in Africa for lack of medical care or clean water, are they my neighbors? If we, the people of the North, say yes, then we will act. We will act together to keep hope alive. If we say no, then they are doomed and so are we. Now today, we would add the challenges of climate, of people driven from their homes because they're no longer sustainable, or fleeing from wars, largely civil, as Lloyd said. Trudeau's desire for righting global inequalities, his desire to improve mechanisms to keep the peace, which Bob spoke so eloquently about, and keep us safe from nuclear annihilation, are certainly not obsolete items. We have a lot more to do. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, this morning, the director of the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History, Mr. Greg Donaghy.
It's never a good idea to volunteer to go last after two comprehensive papers like that. I think you'll find that some of the remarks I make echo themes we've already heard about: rebalancing, pragmatic idealism, hope. But I hope to provide a little bit of a different context, kind of a global context, and a little more texture about where Trudeau was coming from and kind of where he hoped to go. This is taken from a longer piece, and you can find me on the Bill Graham website and get hold of me if you're tempted to read the whole long thing. So the world, I call it power sharing Trudeau's just world order. And the world that Pierre Trudeau encountered in April '69 was different than the world of 1950 or 1960. It was small and crowded. Suddenly, almost overnight, it seemed to many observers in the Department of External Affairs anyways, Canada's international role was much less obvious. Western Europe, Japan, and the People's Republic of China all shook off the last remnants of the Second World War in the 1960s, and they surged onto the global stage, demanding larger voices and bigger roles. New states emerging from the ruins of European empires in Africa and Asia flexed their diplomatic muscle too, and they insisted on being heard. Faster communications, cheap phones, low-cost jet travel, combined with the wave of trade liberalization unleashed by GATT in 1967 to herald a new era of globalization. Fierce competition from the NICs, remember those, the newly industrialized countries of Southeast Asia, and protectionist pressures in the US and Europe hammered the Canadian economy. By the winter of 1981-82, Canada was mired in the deepest recession since the 1930s. At the same time, globalization stretched the international agenda, adding, it seemed, new subjects almost daily. Human rights and women's rights, energy, science, the environment, sports, culture, and education, global revolution, and terrorism. Provinces, cities, and citizens all responded, ramping up their global engagement and sending abroad waves of ministers, bureaucrats, and activists. Trudeau sensed these changes, and he embraced them. By 1968, we know he was already a man of wide global experience, but whose position on world affairs was often a considerable distance from official Ottawas. He disliked the smug stuffiness he found in external affairs, and he was contemptuous of Pearson for backing an aggressive American crusade against communism in Asia and Europe. Yet, pragmatically, he acknowledged that Canadian diplomacy must echo the country's Anglo-American inheritance while bemoaning its failure to reflect Canada's bicultural reality. Appalled by the poverty he encountered overseas, he was sympathetic to national liberation movements everywhere. Colonialism, he thought, bred only hate, suspicion, envy, and arrogance. He welcomed the end of Europe's colonial empires as the most significant development in the second part of the 20th century. An outsider in so many ways, Trudeau's first priority was to liberate Canadian diplomacy, which he thought dominated by Canada's military alliances, NATO and NORAD. He also wanted to end the country's unhealthy fixation with UN peacekeeping. And reflecting the era's gathering globalist thrust, he sought to broaden Canadian diplomacy beyond its traditional focus on the North Atlantic to embrace Latin America, Africa, and Asia, especially the People's Republic of China. Tackling these inherited challenges dominated Trudeau's foreign policy in his first 2 terms in office. But Trudeau's perspective was also global and systemic, and he grasped the shortcomings of the post-war liberal internationalist order. This was particularly obvious in the spring of 1974, when he turned his attention south toward the impoverished and restless masses of the developing world. Hit hard by the decade's surging oil prices and inspired by OPEC's success, the Global South issued a declaration on the new international economic order in May of '74, insisting that the post-war rules of trade, investment, and finance favored the North. The South demanded radical change in the global economic order. Trudeau responded to this challenge in the only foreign policy speech he gave during the July 1974 federal election. If I were to identify any single criterion by which I hope Canada's presence in the world would be judged, he declared, I hope it would be its humanism, its pursuit of social justice. To tackle this priority, he replaced an aging Mitchell Sharp as foreign minister with the more progressive Alan McEachern. In the years immediately ahead, Trudeau told McEachern in his mandate letter, we must choose consciously to express our concern about the widespread inequalities found in the world. A strong moral fiber must be a fundamental ingredient of our foreign policy. However large his reform ambitions, Trudeau was a pragmatic realist, and he eventually trimmed his sails in the face of opposition from the bureaucratic establishment, rooted in the departments of trade and finance. During the spring of 1975, he backed a series of modest incremental measures, notably more aid, commodity price supports, and tariff reductions, all designed to ensure that Canadian policy remained progressive enough to serve as a bridge between North and South, pushing the more important players towards dialogue. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger acknowledged the wisdom of these tactics, engineering Canada's selection as the Western co-chair of the Conference on International Economic Cooperation, set up in October '75 to manage the North-South dialogue. Dynamic tension between the ideal and the possible characterized Trudeau's diplomacy when North-South relations returned to the top of the global agenda in the late 1970s. The publication of Willy Brandt's report on interdependence, North-South, a program for survival, and calls from the Group of 77, the G77, the UN's undeveloped majority, to reopen global negotiations caught Trudeau's attention. Deputy Foreign Minister Alan Gottlieb, a hard-nosed realist who later sneered at Trudeau's tiers-mondism, counseled caution. But Trudeau, determined to make a difference during his last mandate, was drawn to the project and grasped its radical implications for global order. He was, Foreign Minister Mark McGuigan recalled, totally consumed by the possibilities and filled with youthful vigor and idealism. Trudeau resolved to use 3 upcoming summits: his G7 summit at Montebello, the Melbourne Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and the Cancun summit to remind world leaders of their responsibility to humanity and the future. In Trudeau's view, that clearly meant designing a world order that more justly reflected the interests of all its stakeholders. The Prime Minister continued, power sharing is at the heart of the North-South dialogue, and politicians should be able to understand this readily and recognize that it is better to share power now than in the future, even though it may be easier the other way around. What, he asked, could he do to kickstart the process of North-South power sharing? McGuigan was quick to reply, rally behind the effort to relaunch global negotiations. Washington clung to the opposite view. Re-elected in November 1980 to make America great again, U.S. President Ronald Reagan wasted no time telling Ottawa that he wanted the Montebello summit to focus on East-West, not North-South issues. Moreover, the White House fretted that global negotiations would impinge on GATT and the IMF, key Western levers over the world's economy. But Trudeau dug in. Backed by the Germans, Italians, and Japanese, he insisted that the G7 explicitly endorse the G77's call for negotiations. During 3 G7 preparatory meetings that spring, Washington held firm. It did so until just the days before the leaders began to gather, when it finally blinked, unwilling to leave Reagan isolated at this, his first summit. To Trudeau's delight, the U.S. commitment to participate in global negotiations was made more explicit in the Cancun summit and then at the UN, where the US itself presented a resolution to launch global negotiations in December 1981. The text met Canadian expectations, but divided radical and moderate members of the G77, who struggled through the new year to frame a response. Trudeau pushed them to compromise. In January, he and Mexican President Lopez Portillo sent an encouraging message to all the Cancun participants. A month later, Trudeau dispatched Larry Smith, ambassador for North-South relations, on a world tour to get the process started without fussing about the fine print. The endgame was discouraging, however. The US maintained its constructive approach, but Algeria, Iraq, and Libya rejected the US text and imposed their radical views on the G77's moderate majority, scuttling the talks once and for all in July of '82. The end of the search for global negotiations had important consequences for the world and Trudeau. It put paid to the notion of a united global South, and for most of the next 2 decades, its disparate elements would have to deal individually with an increasingly resurgent and conservative North. It did so just as the implications of globalization and the need for a rebalancing of global power began to be felt. Closer to home, the collapse of the dialogue left Trudeau disappointed, and he blamed the developing world for wasting what he called a golden opportunity. Despite requests from his friends, Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere and Jamaican Prime Minister Edward Seaga, Trudeau refused to bring North-South issues to the G7 again. Arguably, the South's claim to a greater share of redistributed global power remained on the margins of the international agenda until the G20 was created in 1999. And finally, Trudeau's North-South campaign had another unpredictable consequence. He had watched the US compromise at Ottawa and Cancun, and he concluded that Reagan, despite his stature as a conservative ideologue, was essentially a skilled politician who would bend and yield to pressure. And this was an insight that would animate Canadian diplomacy during Trudeau's final year in office and shape his next crusade that Bob covered so well, his 1983-84 peace initiative. Thank you.
So looking at our time, we now have about 15 minutes for questions. Given that, I would ask both the questioners and those answering questions to try to keep them as brief as possible and to make them questions, even if that means having a little inflection at the end, something to indicate that it's a question and not a statement would be appreciated. I'd like to begin our questions, though, with our lead student questioner, Nicholas Thompson, a graduate student at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. So, Nicholas, if you'd like to begin.
Hi, everyone. So in 1969, John Lennon of the Beatles famously said that if all politicians were like Pierre Trudeau, there would be world peace. 50 years later, I think it's safe to say, and we can all agree, there's not world peace. So my question to the panel is, was John Lennon wrong, or have we simply not had enough politicians like Pierre Trudeau?
I think the biggest crisis facing us today is a pervasive lack of leadership. So if that answers your question in part, I think Trudeau was a leader. Not everybody liked the directions in which he led, but he led. And a bit like Margaret Thatcher, bizarrely, these two people who did not get along, polls consistently showed that the Brits didn't particularly like her policies, but they liked her leadership. In the same way, I think they liked Trudeau's leadership. I can think of a dozen things that could go wrong suddenly. A couple of them did in the last few days. And the world is not equipped to handle that. And that worries the hell out of me.
My question is for Bob Fowler. How do you respond to the evidence that on his peace initiative in his meeting with Reagan, Trudeau was essentially knocking at an open door? we have evidence, including in his published diaries, that Reagan was already concerned about the East-West climate. He'd been traumatized by the KAL shoot-down just as much as Trudeau was. He'd seen, ironically, a TV movie about the consequences of nuclear war that alarmed him. I'm wondering if, when he had the meeting with Trudeau, Reagan wasn't essentially just agreeing to what he'd already committed himself to in private and telling Trudeau what he wanted to hear.
Well, in part, the answer is yes, but Trudeau is also responsible for the yes. In other words, I started at Williamsburg, where Trudeau had a very rough road to convince other G7 leaders, including Reagan, that the world was in a parlous situation. They had a significant bilateral at Williamsburg, and there was a lot of debate at the table before Maggie got into her comfort to the Kremlin bit. And I agree completely with Greg that to Trudeau's enormous personal surprise, he developed, affection's probably not the right word, but respect for Reagan. And he realized the extent to which Reagan managed politics in the United States across the partisan divide. So, yeah, I mean, the sea didn't suddenly open in December '83 at the Washington meeting. But what he did manage to do, I think, there is he separated Reagan from his advisors. So, I mean, Larry Eagleburger being the principal among them, who had been free to make all kinds of désobligeant statements about Trudeau. And Reagan at that meeting shut that down. After the after. So it was it wasn't a one moment thing, but there's no doubt he got to him.
Greg, you said Trudeau was very alive and sensitive to national liberation movements. But I think you'd agree that in his early days as Prime Minister, he wasn't aware of the national liberation movements of the colonized peoples, Indigenous peoples within Canada. He did become more aware. I guess my real question is liberal internationalism now has to move, as Pierre did, to recognize the need to decolonize relations within our own country with the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit people. Would you agree that that's an amendment, not making liberal internationalism obsolete, but expanding its vision and sensitivities?
Oh, absolutely. And when Bob talked a second ago about when he replied to the question about leadership and he talked about risk, the other, I think, one of the other really important components of leadership is imagination. And I think Trudeau had imagination in spades. And, you know, I think he would imagine a world order that would embrace new forms of decolonization for Indigenous people, not just here, but abroad. I mean, we have to start thinking about that in kind of a serious way. And, you know, he would want to incorporate issues like climate change into kind of the liberal internationalist view of world order. How do we deal with that in a just way that recognizes the fact that, you know, most of the problem comes from the north, not the south?
Sorry, I would point out there was one national liberation movement that he did not support.
Notwithstanding his peregrinations around the world, was something lacking because he may have had the intellectual horsepower, but Canada as a nation state, we were lacking, shall we say, gravity or bottom in terms of our logistics, whether it be defense, that we did not have necessarily the capacity to deploy in terms of humanitarian assistance, the essential felt imperatives. So were people not necessarily taking him seriously, but listening to him, but what are you doing Canada? Because issues, development, and foreign policy are not necessarily drivers in terms of crass parochial, electoral, re-electoral politics.
Well, on development, that was always an issue, and in fact, Pearson had always referred to that and said that when he talked about North-South issues, what he said internationally, he didn't think would go down at home. But I come back to the critique that North-South made in 1980, and that is you have to invest in education on these issues. It's not necessarily natural unless it's, you know, through your church and through missionaries, etc., if we go back in time. But it doesn't just happen automatically. So although in public opinion polls, Canadians always said, yes, we're in favor of doing all of this, when it came down to it, the political message was not coming back. It's not that there was an anti-message coming, but there wasn't a strong message coming. So I think that there did need to, we ought to have invested a lot more in that kind of education. But I would think that's true on a whole range of international issues that people are not spending time thinking about until there's something dramatic, as in the Ukrainian Airlines plane crash with all of those Canadians on it. That crystallizes it.
Sorry, this will not be a direct answer to your question, but I think over the last 50 years, there has been a pretty remarkable, slowly growing understanding of what aid can and can't accomplish. You will know from my comments, despite all that, I think our own aid performance of this wealthy country has been abysmal. And it's so much worse today than it was then. It could have been better. And frankly, his saying, gee, I would have liked to have done more, but you know, now wasn't a good time, I didn't find a terribly convincing argument. It wasn't a good time, but it wasn't a very good argument. We actually thought, I think, with the Colombo Plan and efforts after that, that we could change the world by putting a little bit into the collection plate. The world would suddenly get better. And I mean, you know, the Senate of Canada in the 90s issued a report entitled 60 Years of Failure, how CETA had failed to fix Africa. And it was done with great fanfare. They hadn't worked out that 23 cents per African a year maybe wasn't going to cut it. But nevertheless, it is an enormously complex and expensive business, and we are not scratching the surface of it. Even if we were doing it right, which we didn't always do, we were not scratching the surface. Europeans today have that debate. The Europeans talk about, well, the way to stem the flow of illegal migrants swimming across the Mediterranean is to give them all PhDs, you know, and then they won't come anymore and everything will be okay. It's not going to work out like that.
This isn't exactly a question, but it's a reminder, because I'm 81 years old and I remember a lot of things. And I was a journalist at the CBC, and I remember when Mr. Trudeau, whom I first met when he was Justice Minister in 1968, and then later when he became leader, in 1970 announced the Foreign Policy Review. I'm sure Tom, everybody was very well aware of that. It was for us, as the young intellectual ginger people, a very exciting moment, because we knew it was going to mark something remarkable in Canada, as we had this new presence of somebody who was, and I think that distinction must be drawn, it was somebody who had himself traveled all over the world and therefore was bringing another level of interest to the foreign policy, which we had all brought up as good Pearsonians. But one of the directives of that original Foreign Policy Review, which excited a number of us, was about the fifth or sixth, which said to find out what circumstances will create the word happy was in there, happy environments for our relationships internationally. Something to do with environment was in there right at the beginning. So I think it was never left out. I don't think there was a feeling, no, we won't care about. I think Mr. Trudeau definitely thought about the environment. We know his fondness for the wilderness. We know how he fitted into that wilderness his own abilities to canoe, to do all the things that are very Canadian in their essential ways. And I think that was originally in everything that he was thinking about. I don't think that was not left out. If you look at that, I think, I haven't looked at it recently, but I remember at the time how it struck me. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by the environment? What does he mean by what the way we live is going to be like? So I think it was already in there as part of what we were going to be doing as international people.
Do you think it was a success, the foreign policy review?
Well, we have to. The foreign policy review at the time made us only half happy, right?
Yes.
It made us only half happy. We were glad that it was done because it needed to be done, but I think we were very, very concerned that the things like the North-South and so on, and what happened with the G77, all of that, we had our ups and our downs all the time. It was really like surfing, and I think that. When I hear Bob and Greg and Maureen talk, it reminds me of those ups and downs that we had so much, because we thought there was so much hope, and we thought we could do so much, and we had so much invested in this one figure who could perhaps pull it off for us.
And try to answer, Tom said, was it a success? The famous Foreign Policy for Canadians, 6 little booklets, one of which was not the most important relationship we have. These questions were answered about Africa and about NATO and about the UN and about Latin America, but not about the United States. And it drove everybody crazy. It took 2.5 years to produce. The senior management, of which I was not a part in foreign affairs, couldn't provide an answer on the United States that the Prime Minister could accept. And therefore, no, it was not a success.
Okay, so I think it was a success because it articulated a different kind of vision it articulated his set of priorities and the government's set of priorities. And if you look through the files of external affairs, those priorities became the touchstone for so much that the department did and the initiatives people took in the 1970s. So we have to differ.
To Adrian's point about the environment, don't forget 1972, the Stockholm Conference, which was chaired by Maurice Strong. He wouldn't have gotten that position without very strong lobbying by Canada, and Canada was hugely influential. And one of the big achievements or impacts of that conference was that it led to the creation of environment departments throughout the world. We had one, but most countries didn't. And so, even in the North-South context, I think that was hugely important. Also, the creation of CETA. Let's not forget that happened with Trudeau. The question was, as you look at the peace initiative, there was something very important that happened in 1986. And that was the Reykjavik summit between Reagan and Gorbachev. I'm sorry, I came in late. Yeah. But to what extent, because Trudeau had a close relationship with Gorbachev, he'd known him when he was, I think, agricultural minister, to what extent did the Americans reach out to Trudeau to get his views on Gorbachev as they were trying to figure out who this new leader with a very different vision of what the Soviet Union's role in the world would be? And is there any evidence that there was communication? Because by then, Trudeau had left the scene, but he certainly had an extensive network in Russia and that very close relationship with Gorbachev. So that was my question.
Well, sorry, everybody. NATO was always comparing notes on these things at those times. I mean, who would be in charge? We went through three Soviet leaders in 3 months, 4 months. So everybody wanted to share impressions of each of them in the same way that when anybody got a defector, you know, they trotted them around the other NATO capitals to show and tell. Remember Gorbachev had also, as well as coming here as agriculture minister, he went to the UK, and Maggie famously said, "He's a man with whom we can do business." Yeah, I think people hope that Gorbachev would continue to do and say and walk the talk that he had been talking, but I don't think there was any particular channel of communications, certainly not between a retired Trudeau and Washington on that.
So reason, imagination, intelligence, dialogue, pragmatic idealism, compassion, a man of peace, credibility, noble, justice, civility, power sharing, equity, and hope. These were the words used this morning to describe Trudeau and his world vision. I think for the sake of our planet and its inhabitants, while they don't describe the current dominant worldview, it needs to be one which again reigns supreme. There's much work to be done, and it seems perhaps it's time for another foreign policy review. I'd like to thank our panelists for their thoughtful words, and I'd like to invite everybody to continue the dialogue over coffee. Thank you.